Welcome to the BrainShape podcast, hosted by Dr. Andrea Wilkinson, a show where we cut through the noise of the ever-growing, ever-changing world of brain health. What works and what doesn't, what's fact and what's fiction. We look at tips, tools, and techniques backed up by real scientific studies to help you keep your brain healthy and hopefully have some fun along the way. Now, here's your host, Dr. Andrea Wilkinson.
You're listening to the BrainShape podcast, episode number 21. Last week, we covered part 1 of our 3-part series on happy brain chemicals. If you missed last week's episode, I suggest you go back and listen to it first before jumping into today's episode. Today, we'll be talking about oxytocin, our brain's love chemical, and endorphin, our brain's pain-masking chemical. Dr. Breuning also shares with us some exciting information and insights about how to build new neural pathways. Our guest, Dr. Loretta Breuning, is the founder of the Inner Mammal Institute, which helps people manage the ups and downs of their mammal brain. She is also a professor emerita of management at California State University, East Bay, and the author of 8 books, including Habits of a Happy Brain, which talks about the brain chemicals that make us feel good and how to stimulate them naturally. Here we go. Here is Dr. Loretta Breuning.
So moving on to oxytocin. So in the animal world, being with a herd protects you from predators. And the brain evolved to reward you with a good feeling of oxytocin when you're with a herd. So we call that feeling trust. So trust is the feeling of, oh, I'm safe when I'm with these people and they will accept me and now I'm safe. And trust is mutual. Giving and receiving it triggers oxytocin. So in the animal world, if you leave the herd, you can get killed by a predator in an instant. And that's going to threaten your survival. And so what happens is when you leave the herd, your oxytocin falls and you start getting cortisol. You start feeling threatened. And then when you go back to the herd, you get oxytocin and you feel good. So that's how our brain motivates us to feel good when we find acceptance and belonging and to feel threatened when we isolate ourselves. But the bottom line is that herds are annoying. And we would really not rather be with the herd every minute. So from an animal perspective, it's interesting to think, well, first, in order to stick with the herd, you got to constantly watch what they're doing and follow them, which is sort of annoying. Mm-hmm. But in the animal world, if you don't watch, like they could be gone and there you are alone and you get eaten. And that reminds me of, there was a funny book called Did Everybody Go to the Mall Without Me? So that's why young people often end up wiring themselves to constantly monitor the herd and do what everyone else is doing, alas.
Right.
So that's one side of it. And the other side of it is there's a lot of conflict in a herd because you're competing for the same grass when you're all bunched up together. So you would really rather go off to a greener pasture and get your own grass. So you get more dopamine when you follow your own judgment. But then your oxytocin falls and you feel threatened. So every one of us is constantly challenged to balance that desire for acting on our own individual judgment versus the desire for the safety of social support. And that nobody guarantees that you get all of them all the time. You have to make these hard calls. Mm-hmm. So should I go on to endorphin?
Yes, endorphins, which is linked to morphine. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Morphine is what it was called when it was discovered, and today we call it opioid.
Right. And sorry, just to backtrack ever so slightly, the oxytocin is linked to which drug?
You know what? It's one aspect of ecstasy, mm-hmm. but it's also in orgasm. And it's the chemical that causes childbirth and lactation.
Right.
So it's a long story, but let's say it's an ancient chemical involved in attachment and trust.
Right. And some people call it the love chemical or the cuddle hormone.
Exactly.
Right. Okay,
Yes.
great. Okay, we can move on to endorphins.
Good. So, endorphin is the same as opioid chemically, and it is not designed to be on all the time, and we are not designed to seek it. It masks pain with a euphoric feeling, and it's only released when you are actually in pain. So, in the animal world, if you can imagine an animal is attacked by a predator and has these huge jaws ripping its flesh open, and yet it's still able to run to save its life because endorphin masks pain for about 15 minutes. After that, the animal is either dead or it has to hide to protect its injuries. And we need to feel pain to know that we're injured. So if a caveman had a broken leg, endorphin would mask pain for a short time so that the caveman could, let's say, go someplace to call for help. And after that, they have to not walk on a broken leg. So we are not designed to mask pain all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And some interesting examples. So runner's high is the well-known famous example because when you run to the point of pain, you get it. So runners do not get it all the time. They have to run beyond their capacity. And if you continually exercise to the point of pain, you injure yourself, you harm yourself. And so I'm always very clear in my talks to say that I'm not advocating that because it's so tempting to so many people. And there's also that whole world of self-injury of different varieties, including anorexia, which is a way of stimulating endorphin. And alas, the brain habituates, so you need to hurt yourself more and more to get it. And it's just a terrible strategy.
Yes.
So what are healthy ways to get it? So again, as we said before, you can't get a big surge, but you shouldn't be chasing big surges. But you can get a little bit from laughing, which is interesting because laughing stimulates deep inner belly muscles that we don't always use.
Mm-hmm.
You get a little bit from exercise. When I say don't expect to exercise to the point of getting high, but if you are sitting too long and you get up and move around, then you get a little bit. Now, some interesting examples just for people to know how it works. I think hot pepper stimulates a little, and once again, you habituate. So if you have to eat more and more and more hot pepper to enjoy it, then it's not good for you. But let's say if you have, a little hot pepper once every few days, and then a hot tub. I think that's why it's so enjoyable because it's some kind of pain response.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. And that's why the hot pepper as well, because it's painful potentially.
Yeah.
Because it's too spicy.
Yeah, not just potentially, but it's physically. Like your brain is actually saying, ouch, I'm being attacked.
Yeah, exactly. And then you get a little bit of endorphins.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so this is wonderful. So we've talked about dopamine, which is linked to our reward sort of system, and you get it when you're feeling joy and excitement. Oxytocin is the love chemical or the cuddle hormone. So it's the one that's released when you are safe in a herd, and it's sort of centered around trust. Serotonin is the sort of pleasure of social dominance, but not in the context of aggression. It's kind of like this calm confidence that you talked about. But I think most people know serotonin as like the happy brain chemical because it is linked to antidepressants as well. And then endorphins, which you just talked about, it's about masking pain so that you can do what you need to do to survive.
Yes.
So this is all extremely interesting. And I wondered if you could maybe touch on the point about building, because you mentioned how we know which actions to take to sort of gain these rewards or the hit of these happy chemicals because of our past experiences. So we've built these sort of neural pathways as children, and things that brought us joy and excitement as a child that gave us that dopamine hit are still things that we would seek out today to elicit that same sort of hit of dopamine or that same feeling of joy and excitement. So for example, if someone played sports as a child and caught, pop fly balls in the baseball diamond, then that was tied to a lot of joy and excitement for them as children, then they would sort of seek that out now and still feel that same level of joy and excitement.
And acceptance and pride and respect. Getting respect from others is the serotonin thing. So if you think of like the alpha chimpanzee, that others don't even try to take a banana when they're in the room. You know what I mean? So that's like when other people sort of defer to you and give you recognition. Mm-hmm. Every child notices what gets recognition and what doesn't.
Right. Exactly. And so how is it that we can build new neural pathways? You mentioned that they're built sort of when we're in children or in childhood, but are we capable of building new ones, and how do we go about doing so if we can?
Sure. So yeah, this is the core subject of my work. I think it's all much more complicated than people are led to believe. There's this new idea that we grow new neurons throughout life. But the bottom line is that the new neurons are not connected to anything. And neurons that are not connected to anything, it's sort of like a hard drive with no data on it,
Right.
So let's say that the apps you already have are much more efficient than you sitting down and writing a program on your computer from scratch and then using the program to do the job, So you use the apps that are already written. And that's basically when we're young, our brain is designed to build big, strong, efficient neural pathways easily. So we rely on those pathways, and they're the ones that tell us both how to do things and how to get positive emotions and avoid negative emotions.
Right.
So what can we do to build new pathways later on? The simple answer is repetition, that it takes much more repetition than you think, but it also takes the courage to, once you've repeated, you build a small neural pathway, and we don't really like to use a small little dirt trail when there's a nice big highway paved somewhere else. So it takes courage to say, I'm going to use the back roads of my brain rather than just coasting on the roads that I've built up my whole life. And a simplest example of that everyone can relate to, your native language, you were not born speaking it. And in fact, in your earliest years, it took a lot of repetition and effort to learn it. But you learned it because that's how you got attention and rewards. And when you said a certain word, everybody got excited, and so you repeated it. So your native language is a set of neural pathways that are myelinated, which makes those neural pathways so efficient that it takes almost no effort for you to think of a word. Now, if you decide that you want to study a foreign language in adulthood, it's damn hard, and you have to repeat and repeat. And also, like when I studied French, for example, and they teach you when you use this and when you use that, and there's an equivalent in English, but in English you never had to think about it. In English you just automatically know without consciously knowing the rule. And so let's say that a person studies a foreign language and they put in all that effort and repetition, but then you go to another country and you have to order a meal from a waiter, and maybe you feel a little shy about speaking the foreign language, so you just blurt it out in English. So that's sort of the idea of the challenge of building new neural pathways and then having the courage to use them. And the bottom line is that with happy chemicals, when you do a new behavior, it doesn't feel good the first time. So for example, if I'm used to having cookies every afternoon at 4 o'clock, and I decide that the cookies are not good for me, and I'm going to reward myself in a different way at 4 o'clock. So the first time I do that, it's not going to feel good. I'm going to want the cookie.
Yeah.
But if I find a new way to treat myself at 4 o'clock, and I do that every day, like think of an example as like eat some cashews and watch some comedy, take a 10-minute break, watch some comedy and eat cashews. So if I do that for 45 days, then I will start to naturally just reach for my new treat the way I naturally reached for my old treat. But it takes a lot of repetition to get to that point. And before that, don't expect the new choice to feel good from the beginning, because your old pathway is already so well developed.
Right, exactly. So when we're talking about building these new neural pathways or new ways of executing on some sort of goal behavior, it's not just you're going to do it once and it's going to be super, fulfilling and easy to accomplish. It takes some sort of effort and repetition. And you mentioned in one of the talks I listened to of yours that I saw on YouTube that neurons connect when dopamine flows. And so could you speak a little bit about that and how this sort of dopamine happy chemical that's linked to reward actually plays a role in how these new brain cells are connected?
Sure. So let me give you a sort of example that is widespread today. When you want to use a new app, like let's say I haven't been using a certain thing and I decide, I should really start using that. And you go there and you try to register and everything goes wrong. Does that happen to you? Like, it happens to me so much. Like, I think it's going to be, I'll just do this in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And everything goes wrong and I get so frustrated.
Yeah.
And so how do I calm myself down is like, I have to remind myself of, I've done this in the past. So each time I succeed, it's like, I'm not going to give up. I'm going to try again. Each time I succeed, like I remind myself, wow, my life is better today because I persisted in learning to use this new app or that new technology. And so each time you persist and succeed, you build a new pathway and you can generalize and not just think about succeeding at that one thing, but learn to believe in your own ability to expect that your steps will get rewards even when you're totally frustrated.
Right. And then it's about that whole notion of sort of moving in the right direction to whatever the goal is.
Yeah. And then if I could give you a more subtle example, in my book, I explain when I was learning to understand how I got wired, and, it's easy. People often focus on the negatives of how they got wired, the pain. But what about the positives? Like, how did I learn to love X, Y, or Z? Mm-hmm. And that all happens unconsciously. Like it's sort of basically things you're exposed to, things you see other people enjoy, things you get applauded for. So one thing that happened to me by chance, like I noticed that I love color. Mm-hmm. And it's funny because, I married a guy who loves gray. So maybe that helped me notice that, like, I get pleasure out of color. And my opinion is, if you don't like it, fine. But I like it, because maybe there's some like, oh, that's so déclassé to be colorful, Yeah. I mean, I should tell you that I have an orange car, like a bright orange car. It's like, it's free, it doesn't cost anything to get the orange car. Like, why wouldn't everybody want the orange car? I don't get it,
Yeah.
So I looked in my past. I don't have orange hair, by the way, or I mean, although you could say I sort of do but I mean, I don't have blue hair or anything. So when I was young, a few things happened, but basically when I was a kid, I was not allowed to make many choices. And also my mother was not happy very often. But there was one point in time when my mother inherited this tiny amount of money. It would be like maybe like the equivalent of $10,000 today, or maybe $5,000, I don't know. And she decided to redecorate the living room. And she went shopping and she brought me, and she actually asked my opinion, and she actually cared about my opinion. And she actually showed me samples of different colors and asked me, would I like this or that? And then I saw how excited and happy she was about this whole project. And that wired me to take pleasure in that kind of stuff, because that was one form of pleasure that I was exposed to, and I was not exposed to many forms of pleasure. So each person can think about like sort of that random early experience that wired them to take pleasure in X or Y. And what we could all do is build on those circuits. So for example, I got to enjoy decorating, and I could like redecorate my house over and over and over, but then I wouldn't really feel like I was getting anywhere in life, you know?
Right.
So it's like, okay, I'm going to stop redecorating my house and I'm going to put that energy into something else, but I'm going to make other things a pleasure. So you see that my website is colorful, and, if I'm doing Twitter or Facebook and I'm creating graphics and I make them colorful. So how can I take things I already enjoy and make some new activity be enjoyable?
I really like that.
To learn more about the work that Dr. Loretta Breuning is doing on happy brain chemicals, you can visit her website at innermammalinstitute.org. I'll put the link in the show notes. And don't forget to tune in next week, where we'll be sharing the conclusion of our 3-part series with Dr. Breuning. If you've missed any of this, you can dive into the show notes for this episode and all past episodes at www.brainshape.ca/podcast. To access the show notes from today's episode specifically, just type episode 21 in the search bar and today's episode will pop right up. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope that this episode taught you about 2 very important brain chemicals, oxytocin, our brain's love chemical, and endorphin, our brain's pain-masking chemical. And I hope you got some really important insights about how we can build new neural pathways and what you can do to try to change them. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so that you'll be notified every time we publish a new episode. And since we're a weekly show, I'll see you back here next week, where we'll be sharing the conclusion of our 3-part series with Dr. Breuning. Specifically, we'll be talking through some of the excellent content she covers in her many books, including Habits of a Happy Brain, Tame Your Anxiety, and The Science of Positivity, and how you can find out more about her and her podcast, The Happy Brain. In the meantime, you can follow me on social media at BrainShapeTO, and be sure to let me know if there are any specific topics that you want me to cover on the podcast. Until next time, keep your brain in shape. And as always, it's been such a pleasure hanging out with you.